This show is brought to you by SalCal Real Estate Connections.
Yes, welcome to Telescope View. Tonight we get into our next episode concerning UFOs going back in time, as we did get an email from a viewer that wanted to know about what was going on with UFOs in the BC time frame. And boy, that's going back, huh, Rick?
It is. We're gonna go back pretty far. I think we've mentioned before that Roswell started the modern era of the UFO, but UFOs have kind of shown up or been around for pretty much all recorded history. It goes back as far as some of the first known civilizations, like the Sumerians, who talked about a group called the Anunnaki. But I'm not going to get into that. I mean, people have heard some of this before. We're going to talk about a few groups that everybody knows about. For example, the Egyptians. We'll talk about the Egyptians. We're going to talk about, South America, Mesoamerica, Incas, Mayan, that type of stuff. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And we're going to talk about some artwork that kind of shows some odd things. And we're going to go back to that concept of redefining reality. If we look at some of this stuff with a 21st century eye, we're going to see something different than what an archaeologist may have seen when they discovered it in the 18th century or the 19th century. Because remember, if we go back in time, let's go back as far as the 19th century. There's a guy by the name of Dr. Semmelweis. And he was the first guy to come up with this concept that our body might not just be body and soul, there might be microorganisms. And nobody believed him. That can't be, they don't exist. But they do, don't they? And at that point, reality was science didn't know about it, so it didn't exist, but it does. So we're going to be looking at the same kind of concept. We're going to be looking at things that might say, well, if we redefine our science, some of these things may actually exist. And if we look at some of these ancient artifacts with a 21st century view, we may see something a little different. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about.
I mean, the artifacts, when you're talking that time frame, are really special. And it's hard to understand, and how they didn't recognize what they really were. As far as they were concerned, it had something to do with religion or a myth.
It was probably a religious connotation. As far as we know, remember, archaeology in part is theory. Certain archaeology is fact. We can find by tools and things the way they did things. But sometimes when we look at Egyptian hieroglyphs and things, we can read and we have some codices for these, but we don't know exactly what they were doing or what they were thinking. So maybe they knew more. But the truth is they drew, carved, or painted what they saw, okay, and attributed it to terms that they understood, references that they understood. And we have some photographs that we want to show, and we're going to go far. We're going to start back at 3100 BC, roughly 3100 BC, which is 3,000 years before Christ. We have a photograph number 1, which is the city of Abydos in Egypt. And for the ancient Egyptian, Abydos was one of the holiest sites in the world, which leads to the question, why? It was the cult center for the god Osiris, and it was the gateway to the underworld. But a photograph that you're looking at right now is of carvings in a wall that were found actually behind another wall. There was like a plaster wall, and when that broke down, they found these carvings. These are for real. And of course, the archaeologist says, oh, it's graffiti. Well, if you look at that graffiti, if you look in there, on a 21st century view, you look at that, and you're going to see a helicopter. You're going to see a submarine, and we can see all those things in there, and what are they? Now, in the 19th century, it might be something else, but if I took a 12-year-old boy or girl, showed them this photo, and said, what is that? They're going to say, oh, I see a helicopter, I see a submarine, it's an airplane. How do we explain that? And the thing is, archaeologists cannot explain this, okay? They cannot. So were the Egyptians, who are very smart people, I mean, mathematics, engineering, were they simply carving what they saw? So when we get into something like this, we're talking about one of those questions that we just can't answer. Once again, our science is immature in that regard. And we're finding that our science is immature in a lot of regards. I mean, we're starting to learn that some of the long-held beliefs about mathematics don't actually hold, okay? We know now that some things aren't, as far as earthly, they work, but some of our physics may not apply elsewhere in the universe. So we're starting to learn some of that. So now we have to look at this with kind of a different viewpoint.
I mean, when you think about it, and you're absolutely right, when you would get a little kid to look at this picture, he'll tell you exactly what's in it.
Right.
And when you looked at a grown back in the day, I don't even know if they knew what was in it.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is so interesting, I'll tell you, Rick.
And I'm mentioning again our mathematics, the one thing I was thinking about is prime numbers, and we've always been taught that prime numbers, the last three numbers of a prime number, when you get into big numbers, will always be random. Always be random. Well, at Stanford University, they found that's not true. They got up to numbers so high because of the computers that they found that wasn't true. Now, people will say, well, that doesn't matter because the numbers are so high. But when you're dealing with the universe, you're dealing with numbers that high, okay? So now, all of a sudden, that doesn't apply, possibly, out in the universe. So that first photo that you've seen, that's Abydos, Egypt, and definitely is going to lead you to say, gee, you know, what's going on there? We have a second photo here, which is from Egypt. Now we're getting a little, this is new stuff. We're talking about 1300 BC.
How's that?
Okay, we're moving up. And we have a photograph of people, of two people that I think people have heard of, is Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Everybody has heard of Akhenaten and Nefertiti.
Yeah, they anchored the NBC News.
Yes, they did for a number of years.
Yep.
But what you do is you see them sitting on a, I guess you'd call this a fresco here, or a carving, and on their lap are their children. And above them appears to be what is a disc, which is actually a sphere. If it was a disc, it wouldn't have had the relief that it did. That sphere is supposed to be the god Aten. And according to archaeologists, their belief here that Aten is sharing with them the rays of life.
So he was the sun god?
He was the sun god.
Okay.
Now, another interpretation has come from this. We have learned from Roswell that apparently it was possible to share data and knowledge within crystal spheres. And the belief started to become, and the government believes this, and this is why they got interested in some of this stuff, is that, in fact, some of the reason why the ancients were so interested in jewels and crystals and gold was not so much for the financial wealth, but for the intellectual or knowledge that might be encoded in there from the sky gods.
Wow.
But if you look at this picture, the other interpretation is that Aten is sharing with Akhenaten and Nefertiti knowledge, the knowledge of the gods. And a lot of people are starting to say, as we read some of this, this is a very plausible option here. When in the 18th century, when this was found or whenever, that wasn't plausible because we didn't have the technological understanding at that point. So there's another one. That's 1300 BC.
Wow.
Okay. Again, could be wrong, could be any number of things, but
Now,
it leaves questions.
I have a question, Rick. When he said that was the sun god, or thought that was the sun god, was he the one that at the time they believed in the multiple gods, and he said no, there's only one?
Akhenaten was the one who wanted to bring it down to one god.
That's what I thought.
He was not real popular at that point. Akhenaten was also the one who did not look like all the other pharaohs.
Yeah,
he looked odd.
He had features that resemble something I won't even want to get into.
But he wasn't beautiful, and they were all depicted always as being beautiful, and that wasn't the case with Akhenaten, and nobody can understand why he went in that direction. You have to be careful when you look at all this too, is because you have to understand the political climate of the times, and understand. I mean, every civilization, just about every civilization, has some story about sky gods. Why sky gods? Very interesting. But you also have to realize is that political power could be gotten by your association with the gods. So that's why some people might want to say, we did this with the gods, or the gods said this. But the question is, as we look at history, there's a gap. And there's a missing link. And the question is, were there civilizations even before these that were even smarter or more intelligent than what we've seen? Did some of these civilizations have help from somewhere else? And in their writings and their stories, they say they did. They say they had help from the sky gods to do some of this. And we can talk about the building of the pyramids. We can talk about all this, and there's questions that remain to be seen. Just like in the next few photos we're going to look at, like this third photo that we have here, which is Tiwanaku and Pumapuku in Bolivia.
I have no idea what you just said.
Okay, it's just two cities in Bolivia, very ancient cities.
Very ancient and very interesting with stonework, I'll tell you that.
I mean, some people are going to say, there's questions as to how old it is. Some people say 17,000 years old. That's probably wrong. Some people say it's better dated to 600 AD. Okay. There's questions as to exactly who created these two cities. Was it the Aymara Indians? Some archaeologists believe, yes, it was the Aymara Indians. But the interesting thing about these two cities, and you're seeing picture number 3, which is the entryway. If we move on now to picture number 4, you're seeing another piece in here. What we have here are are megaliths. And the question becomes, how did they create these megaliths? Because archaeologists agree that the Aymara Indians did not have any form of writing, nor did they have the wheel. Okay, so kind of tricky when you're building things this big. They believe that they probably created these things using pictographs or iconography. Maybe. But when we look at these, even if you believe that, now the other thing that they said is they didn't believe for many years that they even had metal tools. Now, on one hand, some of the stuff that you're looking at, picture number 4 that we're looking at here, this is andesite, very, very hard stone. You're not likely going to carve that very quickly with copper tools.
You're not kidding.
Unless you have a certain hardened copper tool, which they were known to possibly make, but still it's going to take a lot of time. And then there's fitting the stones. Okay, if you have a square, you might be able to fit them. But the precision at what this was done, some engineers today say, we don't know that we could duplicate this without a lot of work. Now, one picture here, the gray one, that's andesite. The next picture of some walls, picture number 5, that's red sandstone. Red sandstone is easy to carve. You could do it with stone tools. You can polish it with sand. And they said that they probably polished this with sand. That's true, but you can only polish to a certain degree with regular sand. You then have to make the sand finer and finer and finer to get a very polished finish. So then we have red sandstone. Yes, maybe they quarried that. They did quarry it. The question starts to be is that some of this megalith, these stones are weighing 25 and 30 tons.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they're heavy.
How do you move them without a wheel? Do you roll them on trees? Possible, but what kind of people are you going to need and how many people are you going to need to move this and how fast are you going to move? Because none of this stuff was quarried here. The andesite was there, but the red sandstone was quarried near Lake Titicaca in Bolivia and supposedly brought up. How do you do that? The next question starts to become, if you believe everything the archaeologists said, okay, let's say maybe they're right. They carved it, even though it's hard to believe they did.
Yeah.
How do you lift it without pulleys and tackles? You're going to use levers. Maybe. Okay. What size lever are you going to use to raise a 25-ton block of stone? Maybe I can do it 4 feet. But if I want to raise them 50 feet, 100 feet, how am I going to accomplish that? Am I going to build ramps? Then the question becomes, and I had an engineer friend of mine who was in the Navy, Seabees. He goes, his biggest concern is how do you reinforce either the ground
under it
so it doesn't crush, because they had to do that for tanks in Iraq, or the scaffolding to bring it up. How is all that done? So you start to look at that and you say, all right, even if I get to the point where maybe they could have made some of this, how did they lift it? I start to believe more and more on this is that maybe they did some of this construction, but I'm firmly believe that they had some kind of help. They didn't have mathematics because they had no writing. They didn't have geometry. Yet they drilled holes. Well, you can tap a hole in with a stone tool. With this precision, some engineers say it's not possible. So you still have those archaeologists who go back to, well, if it's not science, it's religious myth or whatever we can attribute it to. There's another picture here, and this is the thing that really starts to concern us, number 6, is one of the great, it could be a parade ground. We don't know what it is. But you're seeing some walls here. And on these walls, you can see some stumps or whatever. Those are actually faces that were carved into the walls, or they were carved in and placed in the walls. And you go to photo 7, you can see the faces a little bit better. And this is red sandstone. Okay. Here's the problem with the faces. The faces reflect features from people all over the world.
Yeah, straight.
You have African faces. You have Oriental faces. You have Egyptian faces. You have North American faces. The Amara Indians, some people believe they were even more advanced than the Incas who followed them. How did they know about all this? How did they know about all these people? Or was there somebody before them that knew about these people? Or were they told about these people by someone else? When these sites were found, the Incan culture, the Incan tribe, the chief was asked, did you build this? And they said, no, we didn't. The sky gods built it, and they built it in one night. Well, actually, it wasn't necessarily sky gods. They said they came from the ocean. But the interpretation of the books as to what is ocean, what is sky, is still a question. The sky gods built it in one night. Now, was that a political thing so they could gain power, or did that really happen? So that's a question. Question number 8 shows some drilling that they did. Very, very fine drilling. Is that a possibility? And then, of course, we have photo number 9, which is a sculpture of a statue with what looks to be some type of a helmet, but that's all very much possible. Now, the question is, do we have the time to get into some of the artwork that actually happened? What do we have for time here? Okay, so the next picture I want to look at is another piece of artwork, which is picture number 10. This is the cover of the sarcophagus for Mayan King Pakal, 683 AD. Now, when you take a look at that, it surely does look like somebody sitting in a space capsule focused on a periscope. What is that? And according to his people, this is where King Pakal, when he passed into the sky to be with the gods. What is it that you're looking at there? There's another carving that we see, photo 11, which there's question as to whether or not this is real or not, but Incan tribespeople were wearing some of this at one point, and it looks like there's a flying saucer in there. Did these people make this up? Is it myth, or did they carve what they believe? Now, to carry the ancient astronaut concept a little farther, I have a last picture on here, which is actually a picture from Mars, from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in NASA. Go to the website. Don't believe me, look it up.
What's the website?
NASA, or JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, nasa.com. Okay. In it, you're going to see a photograph, and in the center I have highlighted, laying on its side is basically the face of a lioness. You can see her nose, you can see her eyes, and you can see her ears. On Mars, it looks like a statue. And then, right to the left of that is another piece of stonework with straight carvings in it, which really can't be natural. I have a friend who worked at JPL, and he said confidentially, there are scientists who disagree now within JPL as to whether some of the stuff they're seeing is natural or represents some ancient culture. We found ancient organisms on Mars. We know that exists. That's information that came out. We found now that there's water on Mars, liquid water underneath the poles, which can harbor alien organisms. So aliens exist. That's not the question. The question now becomes, have they come here to Earth? And some of the stuff that we're looking at certainly does suggest maybe that's happened. And have they even possibly been to Mars? And those are archaeological artifacts. That doesn't even get into some of the other stuff that we have, which is artwork that appeared throughout the centuries. Okay, if we go to picture 13, we have a piece of artwork from the 15th century. It's called The Annunciation by Crivelli. And if you look kind of in the upper left center, you see something in the sky, which looks like a flying saucer. The next one is The Baptism of Christ from the 15th century by de Gelder. You see something above at the very top of the photo. It looks like a saucer with rays coming down. Then we have the Madonna from Ghirlandaio from the 15th century. Behind her is something in the sky. The insert shows what that is. It looks to be some type of craft with light or something coming off it, which could be a halo, which we know electromagnetic fields could create. And then, of course, you have the 14th century fresco, picture number 16, which shows somebody looking over their shoulder appeared to be in some type of a spaceship.
Kind of a craft, yes.
Okay, this one is really kind of odd. People can't explain any of these. What were the artists thinking? What were they trying to reproduce? Of course, 14th century, 15th century, they weren't there at the time, but why did they create these drawings, and how do we explain them? I think that the Gelder one is particularly powerful, but this 14th century fresco is really pretty interesting.
If only they had videotape back then, we wouldn't have to try to figure all this stuff out.
Instant replay.
Well, the thing that's really interesting, though, is that anytime they talked about gods, they had something to do with sky, up in the air.
Well, and that's the last thing I want to kind of show everybody, is here we have a Kachina doll. Okay, on the desk here we have a Kachina doll, and the Kachinas were representations of the sky gods, and they meant different things to the Hopi. But there's a number of these Kachinas and the Kachina gods who wore helmets.
Oh, wow.
Like this one. And of course the Kachinas often are endowed with feathers, representing flying
That's
creatures.
right.
But what's the story with the helmets? And the story, according to legend, is that the sky gods wore helmets. Some of the sky gods wore helmets like this. And what does this kind of look like to us? It looks like some older helmets that we might have dealt with. In fact, there's a guy by the name of Wiley Post. Some people won't know who he is. Look it up. He was an adventurer early in the 20th century. And he tried all kinds of things with flight. If you look at the first helmet he created, it was round like this with one circle hole, almost looked like one of the Minions. Okay, right in the center. Looked a lot like this. And we see helmets like this, not just on Kachinas, but we see it in Mayan art. We see it in Mayan sculpture, Aztec. We see this around the world. We're not even getting into India and the Vimanas and some of this other technology. Why so much interest in the sky? And these people knew a lot about the sky. They knew about the movements of the earth and the stars and the planets. But why so much interest in the stars? Going forward, it starts to connect in with things that we then learn in the modern era of the UFO. We hear stories that kind of relate back to, the sun gods, the sun project. That's why the book is named The Sun Project. It talks about, it all started with the sun gods. Now the sun means rebirth to the ancients, okay? So when we're talking about the sun project here, we're talking about something called rebirth.
Rebirth, yeah.
So now the question is, if they've been here, if we've even started to pique your interest as to some of this might be real and they've been here, and why not? We're going to do the same thing somewhere else. Why did they come here? What was their purpose for coming here? So.
And have they come back, or are they thinking of coming back, or did they say...
Have they come back?
Enough of it.
Well, we're going to talk about that.
Let me tell you, the evidence of UFO and ET, history is really on Earth with us. There's no question about it.
Well, and the thing is, after World War II, after Van Daniken, but after Roswell, all of a sudden the United States government got interested in all this. They all got interested on this, and they started funding projects through the Smithsonian, National Endowment for the Humanities, and some other groups where they don't really know what they're looking for. But that's what they're looking for.
I mean, the history. I'll tell you, I was visiting Arizona and was talking to a Hopi Indian.
Yep.
And we started talking. He's telling me the world is going to reinvent itself.
Yep. That was their belief.
That was their belief. Every so many years, the world reinvents itself.
Yep.
Well, Rick, as usual, we're just having too much fun. The time is flying.
We're just getting started.
We're just getting started, Bill. And I'll tell you, if anyone has any information they want to talk about, please email us at theviewshow@AOL.com. And as you could see, we are really going to get into some very interesting subjects. Do you agree, Steve?
Oh, this is beyond belief. Every time I listen to you speak, it just opens up so many more questions.
And all this stuff some people have heard before, the ancient astronaut theory, but we're going to talk a little bit more as we go forward in the next show, is that the U.S. government, this is information that nobody else has, is I'm going to give you information about classified files where the U.S. government has expressed interest in this stuff. Because they're looking for the technologies just like the Nazis were.
Oh, yeah.
Or the Germans.
Yeah.
I mean,
when you think about it, it's just fascinating, I'll tell you. I cannot wait till the next show. Thank you for viewing in, and as usual, time is flying by. Good night.